You think you know Snow White? The fairest of them all, the poisoned apple. The kiss that breaks the spell, but the story you were told is a lie. A sanitized fairy tale built on centuries of editorial erasure. What if I told you that in the original 1812 manuscript, carefully preserved in the Berlin State Library, the woman who orders Snow White's murder isn't a jealous stepmother, but her own biological mother? What if the demand for her lungs and liver wasn't proof of death, but preparation for a cannibalistic ritual? An act of consumption meant to transfer youth and vitality from daughter to mother. What if the 7 dwarfs weren't magical creatures but stunted child laborers? Their growth arrested by toxic mining dust and malnutrition, their bodies permanently deformed by years crawling through 3-foot tunnels. And what if the prince who awakened Snow White wasn't motivated by love, but by necrophilic obsession with a beautiful corpse displayed in a crystal coffin? The brothers. Grimm didn't write this story to entertain children. They encoded something far more disturbing. A warning about maternal betrayal, systematic child exploitation, and the deadly cost of female beauty in a world where daughters were either commodities to be traded or threats to be eliminated. Once you understand what the glass coffin really meant, once you see why the original villain consumed her daughter's organs, you'll realize this was never just a bedtime story. It was testimony. And the horror is that every detail was real. Let's start with the most profound act of erasure in fairy tale history. In Jacob Grimm's precise handwriting, on yellowed pages now preserved behind glass in Berlin, appears the German word die Mutter. Not stepmother, simply mother. No hesitation, no correction. This woman, Snow White's biological mother, doesn't merely wish her daughter dead. She orders her huntsman to take the 7-year-old girl into the forest, stab her to death, and return with her lungs and liver as proof. When the huntsman brings back what she believes are Snow White's organs, actually those of a wild boar, she doesn't dispose of them or bury them. The text is explicit about what happens next. The cook boils them in salt, and the queen eats them. She consumes them greedily, believing she is devouring her own child's flesh, inhaling her daughter's breath of life, absorbing the vitality housed in those specific organs. This isn't metaphor. This is anthropophagy, ritualistic cannibalism rooted in the ancient belief that consuming another's organs transfers their qualities to the eater. The choice of organs is devastatingly specific. In medieval European folklore, the lungs contained pneuma, the breath of life, the very essence of the individual's spirit. The liver was believed responsible for blood production and purification, the organ that generated youth and strength. By consuming these organs, the mother believes she can arrest the passage of time, can literally incorporate her daughter's youth into her own aging body. This is symbolic vampirism, a perverted sacrificial rite where the mother attempts to preserve her power by feeding on her successor. The use of the boar as substitute carries its own weight. In antiquity, wild boars were frequent stand-ins for human sacrifice in rites meant to appease chthonic deities, gods of the earth and underworld. The huntsman's substitution transforms what should be a maternal protection into evidence of how far the queen has fallen. She salts and boils and feasts, Epicurean in her pleasure, never knowing she's consuming animal flesh while her daughter escapes into a forest that offers no protection, only different forms of exploitation. The brothers Grimm changed this detail in later editions, transforming the biological mother into a stepmother to make the story palatable to 19th century bourgeois audiences who held the maternal figure sacred. But this editorial choice reveals something profound about what the story originally meant to communicate. By making the villain a stepmother, later versions allowed audiences to process domestic tensions without indicting motherhood itself. The original, however, doesn't offer that comfort. It forces us to confront a primal betrayal, the mother, as destroyer of the child, the womb that gave life now demanding death. This wasn't fantasy. Court records from 16th century Bavaria document cases like Margaretha von Waldeck, whose sudden wasting illness at age 13 occurred just weeks after her betrothal to a powerful duke, a match that would have elevated her above her mother's station. The court physician's notes, discovered centuries later in monastery archives, hint at symptoms consistent with mercury poisoning. Her mother inherited not only Margaretha's dowry, but the right to negotiate a new alliance with the spurned duke's family. No investigation was ever conducted. Such cases weren't aberrations. They were patterns whispered about in castle corridors, but never formally prosecuted, creating an atmosphere where every young noblewoman understood that her emerging beauty might mark her for death. The systematic nature of these crimes reveals something even more disturbing about the social structures of early modern Europe. Young women of noble birth existed in a precarious balance between asset and liability. Their beauty and virtue could secure advantageous marriages that elevated entire families, but that same beauty could threaten existing power arrangements. A mother whose influence at court derived from her own beauty and social connections faced an impossible calculation as her daughter matured. Every compliment directed at the daughter was a diminishment of the mother. Every marriage proposal the daughter received was a reminder that the mother's value was declining. In a world where women had no independent source of power, where their worth was entirely mediated through male attention and social validation, the daughter's ascendance wasn't just competition, it was the mother's social death made visible. The tale captures this toxic dynamic with devastating precision, showing us not an aberration but a logical consequence of systems that reduced women to their reproductive and aesthetic value. The magic mirror is more than a plot device. It represents the unforgiving internal judge, the patriarchal standards that reduce a woman's entire value to her physical appearance. Historically, the presence of large mirrors in noble households marked immense wealth and status. These elaborate mirrors cost more than entire estates, their production involving techniques jealously guarded by Venetian glassmakers. The Queen's daily consultation with the mirror is her first descent into witchcraft. Reflective surfaces have long been linked to divination through scrying, the practice of seeing visions in polished surfaces. But the mirror's deeper function is psychological. It serves as the Queen's inner mirror, an omniscient witness to her aging that forces a confrontation between her and her daughter's burgeoning youth. When the mirror shifts its allegiance, declaring Snow White the fairest, the Queen experiences what modern psychology calls narcissistic collapse. In her psychological framework, she is her beauty. To no longer be the fairest is to cease to exist. This isn't vanity as we understand it. This is existential terror. The mirror's verdict is a death sentence, not for Snow White initially, but for the Queen's entire sense of self. Her subsequent murder attempts aren't acts of simple malice, but desperate, tragic attempts at self-preservation by eliminating the object that highlights her obsolescence. The mirror functions as the patriarchal voice internalized, the judge who can never be satisfied, who offers validation only to withdraw it as the inescapable march of time continues. Notice that the Queen never questions the mirror's authority. She doesn't rage against the standard itself. She accepts that a woman's worth is determined by her beauty, and having internalized this standard completely, she can only respond by destroying the competition. Consider what this tells us about the world these women inhabit. Beauty isn't merely advantageous, it's survival currency. In medieval Germanic territories, young noblewomen like Snow White were political pawns, their beauty determining their value in marriage alliances. A daughter's extraordinary beauty could shift the balance of power within households. The mother's influence, derived from her ability to broker marriages and maintain court relationships, suddenly faced competition from her own bloodline. This explains why the mirror's verdict triggers such extreme violence. The Queen isn't fighting against a person, she's fighting against her own erasure from political relevance. In a world where women had no intrinsic power, where their influence was entirely mediated through beauty and the social capital it generated, the daughter's superior beauty represented an existential threat to the mother's position. her safety, her very right to exist within the power structures of noble society. The mirror's famous question, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" reveals the compulsive nature of narcissistic supply. The queen doesn't ask once and accept the answer. She returns daily, needing constant reassurance, requiring repeated validation to sustain her fragile sense of self. This is the ritualistic self-soothing of someone whose identity is entirely dependent on external confirmation. When that confirmation fails, when the mirror's answer changes, the psychological structure collapses completely. The queen's descent into murderous rage is the consequence of a lifetime spent believing her worth was contingent on a quality that time inevitably steals. The tragedy is that both women are trapped in this system, the mother desperate to maintain her position, the daughter doomed by possessing the very quality that makes her valuable and, therefore, disposable. The mirror also functions as what psychologists call the other, the external authority whose judgment feels absolute and inarguable. The queen has surrendered her internal sense of worth to this external validator. She no longer possesses the capacity to determine her own value. Instead, she's dependent on the mirror's pronouncement to tell her whether she has the right to exist. This psychological dependency creates a terrifying vulnerability. As long as the mirror confirms her supremacy, she feels secure. But the moment it identifies a rival, her entire psychological structure collapses. She experiences what clinicians recognize as ego death, the sensation that the self is disintegrating, that existence itself is under threat. Her violent response isn't calculated strategy, but psychological survival instinct. In her internal landscape, killing Snow White isn't murder, it's self-defense against annihilation. The tale captures the way patriarchal beauty standards become internalized as existential stakes, transforming competition between women into life and death struggles, because women have been taught that only one can be the fairest, and failing to achieve that status means ceasing to matter at all. The seven dwarfs are perhaps the most sanitized element of the entire narrative. Modern adaptations present them as whimsical, singing creatures living in charming woodland cottages. But the historical reality is far more disturbing. In the Hessian mining regions, where the brothers Grimm collected their tales, 16th and 17th century records document the extensive use of child labor in copper and lead mines. These weren't adults of small stature. They were children, often as young as 7 years old, the same age at which Snow White is first targeted for murder in the original 1812 text. The tunnels were so narrow that only the smallest bodies could navigate them. Children crawled on hands and knees through passages barely wider than their shoulders, their lungs burning with coal dust and toxic fumes from minerals like arsenic and mercury. The mining archives from Siegen, dated 1618, describe boys and girls who entered the mines at 7 and, if they survived, emerged permanently stunted. Their growth was arrested by severe malnutrition and the crushing weight of the earth above them. Their spines curved from years of crouching in 3-foot-high tunnels. Their skin, deprived of sunlight, turned the pallor of mushrooms. These laborers were referred to in historical documents as arme Zwerge, poor dwarves. The bright-colored caps they wore in Disney adaptations? Those were real. Children wore brightly colored hoods so their bodies could be identified when cave-ins buried them alive. At night, these child miners slept in communal barracks, hidden deep in forests, far from the towns whose wealth they extracted from the earth. Groups of up to 20 children lived in single-room houses, beyond the reach of legal or familial protection. Local girls, often runaways or orphans, would keep house for these communities in exchange for protection and shelter. When Snow White arrives at the cottage and immediately begins cooking, cleaning, making beds, washing linen, and darning socks for 7 small men who work all day and return covered in grime, contemporary audiences would have recognized this arrangement instantly. This wasn't a magical sanctuary. This was survival through transactional domestic labor. Snow White agrees to these terms explicitly. She will perform all household tasks in exchange for the dwarves, providing protection and resources. This mirrors the historical role of young girls in mining communities, where domestic service was the only avenue available to those fleeing abuse or seeking refuge. The relationship is economically grounded in early modern labor dynamics. There's no sentimentality here, no friendship formed through song and dance. There's desperation on both sides. Exploited children sharing space with an abused child, all of them surviving in a geographical nowhere, a legal void where neither the state nor nobility extended protection. The forest in the tale represents this psychological and physical space, the nowhere that existed for young women who fled abusive households. They couldn't return home. They couldn't seek legal protection since their fathers or mothers were their legal guardians. They couldn't survive alone. The mining communities represented one of the few places where questions weren't asked, where authorities didn't venture, where someone like Snow White could trade labor for survival. The brothers Grimm preserved this underground railroad of the medieval period, hidden in plain sight as a fairy tale cottage. The detail that the cottage sits beyond 7 mountains isn't arbitrary. Travelers from Lower Maine, where one historical Snow White candidate lived, had to cross exactly 7 mountains in the Spessart forest to reach the mining regions. Every element that seems fantastical has roots in documented reality, but the reality is far darker than any fantasy because it involved actual children whose bodies were broken and whose lives were expendable in service of extracting wealth from the earth. The economic logic of child mining labor reveals the brutal calculus of early industrial capitalism. Children were preferred not just because they were small enough to fit through narrow passages, but because they were cheaper to employ, easier to control, and if they died, easier to replace. The mines consumed children, literally ground their bodies down through overwork, toxic exposure, and physical trauma. The average lifespan of a child who entered mining work at 7 was shockingly brief. Most didn't survive past their teenage years. Those who did carry permanent damage, respiratory diseases from inhaling mineral dust, skeletal deformities from malnutrition and repetitive stress, neurological damage from mercury and arsenic exposure. The dwarfs of the tale, with their stunted growth and physical abnormalities, weren't products of magic. They were products of systematic exploitation, children whose bodies bore witness to a society that valued extracted wealth more than human life. Snow White's arrival among them isn't an escape into safety. It's a descent into a different circle of hell, where survival requires accepting complicity in an exploitative system. She becomes housekeeper to those who have no house, caretaker to those who have been denied care. Her domestic labor enabling the continued exploitation of child miners by maintaining the barracks where they rest between shifts in darkness and dust. The Queen's 3 murder attempts reveal an escalating pattern that modern criminologists recognize as classic predatory behavior. Each attempt grows more direct, more personal, more intimate. First, she arrives disguised as a peddler woman selling bodice laces, seemingly innocent items that she uses to suffocate Snow White by lacing her too tightly. This is murder disguised as beauty, as fashion, as the very tools women use to make themselves attractive. The symbolism is devastating. The Queen uses the instruments of femininity itself as weapons, transforming the corset meant to create an ideal silhouette into a mechanism of asphyxiation. When the dwarfs return and cut the laces, Snow White revives. The Queen's first attempt fails because it relies on indirect suffocation, because she hasn't yet committed fully to the intimate violence required. Her second attempt intensifies. She returns with a poisoned comb, a more direct attack on Snow White's beauty itself. Combs in medieval noble households weren't simple grooming tools. They were intimate objects, often passed from mother to daughter, carrying familial significance. A mother combing her daughter's hair was a daily ritual of bonding and care. By transforming this symbol of maternal love into a weapon, the tale makes explicit what it has been suggesting all along. the complete perversion of the mother-daughter relationship, where every gesture of care might be an attack in disguise. The poisoned comb represents the toxic intimacy of abuse, the way violence hides within seemingly nurturing acts. When Snow White collapses, the dwarfs remove the comb and she revives again. But the pattern has escalated. The queen is learning that she must be more thorough, more deceptive, more willing to personally administer death. The third attempt is the apple, and here the queen's planning reaches its apex of calculated malice. The apple is red on one side, white on the other, with poison only in the red portion. The queen eats the white half in front of Snow White to prove it's safe, then watches as the girl bites into the poisoned red side. This tactic connects to one of the most chilling aspects of medieval poisoning practices. In Germany, there was a documented practice among those who dealt in poisons, the creation of what were called Judas fruits, named for the betrayer who shared bread with Christ before destroying him. These were apples, or other fruits, partially injected with poison, designed to kill slowly enough that the poisoner could establish an alibi. Picture a feast in a medieval great hall. The hostess selects an apple, cuts it with her own knife, eats half while offering the other to her young rival. Hours later, long after the hostess has retired with witnesses to her good health, the victim begins to convulse. The symptoms Snow White displays match exactly the effects of concentrated belladonna extract, derived from deadly nightshade plants that grew wild in German forests. The poison would cause pupils to dilate, creating an appearance of beauty even in death. The muscles freeze, the heart slows to nearly imperceptible beats. Snow White doesn't die. She enters a state of suspended animation that mimics death so perfectly that even the dwarfs believe she's gone. Her lips remain red, her skin stays fresh, but her body is locked in paralysis. This is why the dwarfs can't bring themselves to bury her. She looks too alive, too perfect. So they place her in a glass coffin where her beauty can be preserved and observed, never realizing she might still be experiencing consciousness trapped in an unresponsive body, aware but unable to signal, a prisoner within herself. The escalating intimacy of the murder attempts reveals the queen's psychological journey from distant command to personal execution. Her first attempt uses the huntsman as intermediary. She orders the death, but doesn't witness or perform it. When that fails, she takes matters into her own hands, but still uses objects as weapons, maintaining some psychological distance from the act of killing. The bodice laces she can tighten and walk away. The poisoned comb she can insert and depart. But the apple requires her presence, requires her to watch Snow White bite into death, requires her to witness the moment of poisoning. This progression mirrors what psychologists observe in perpetrators who overcome initial inhibitions against violence. Each successful act lowers the threshold for the next. Each survival of the victim requires more direct and certain methods. The queen isn't just trying to kill Snow White. She's learning how to become a murderer, overcoming the psychological barriers that normally prevent mothers from destroying their children. By the third attempt, she's willing to stand face to face with her daughter, to smile while offering death disguised as nourishment, to perform the ultimate betrayal of trust that exists between parent and child. The apple, that biblical symbol of forbidden knowledge and the fall from innocence, becomes the vehicle through which the queen completes her own fall, from mother to murderer, from protector to predator. The transparent coffin isn't a fairy tale invention. Noble families across Europe commissioned crystal or glass-topped coffins for young women who died under suspicious circumstances, particularly when questions of inheritance or succession were involved. The coffin served multiple purposes. It proved the heir was truly dead, preventing rival claims that she'd been hidden away. It displayed her beauty one final time, a morbid advertisement of the family's genetic stock. And crucially, it prevented anyone from examining the body too closely for signs of foul play. The glass created an impenetrable barrier between the victim and any who might question the cause of death. When Snow White lies in her crystal coffin, Beautiful and untouchable, she joins a long line of noble daughters whose deaths enriched their families and whose bodies became public spectacles of private crimes. But the coffin also serves another purpose. It transforms Snow White into a perfect object. She becomes art, a sculpture, something to be observed rather than engaged with. This is where the prince enters, and this is where the story reveals its most disturbing psychological dimension. In the Grimm version, the prince doesn't stumble upon Snow White and fall in love at first sight. He becomes obsessed with her corpse. He sees her in the glass coffin and declares to the dwarfs, "Let me have it as a gift. I will honor and prize her as my dearest possession. Not, I will help her, or I will try to save her." He wants to possess the coffin, to own this beautiful dead girl as a decorative object. The dwarfs initially refuse, but the prince begs so persistently that they eventually relent. Moved by his obvious desperation, the prince has his servants carry the coffin everywhere he goes. Not just to his castle, but with him constantly, so he can gaze upon her whenever he wishes. This is the voyeuristic consumption of a beautiful corpse, the eroticization of a woman specifically for her passivity and death-like state. The glass coffin serves as a prison where the maiden is desired precisely because she cannot respond, cannot reject, cannot age or change or assert any will of her own. She is frozen in perfect beauty, eternally available for observation, permanently silent. The 17th century Italian precursor to this tale, The Crystal Casket by Giambattista Basile, makes this necrophilic desire even more explicit. When the king discovers the beautiful doll in the casket, he takes her to his palace, retires to a private room with her, and remains there behind locked doors, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. He refers to the corpse as it or his wife, regardless of her state of decay. Snow White doesn't awaken through love's kiss. That's a 20th century sanitization. In the original Grimm version, a clumsy servant stumbles while carrying the coffin. The impact dislodges the piece of poisoned apple from Snow White's throat, and she gasps back to life, to the shock of everyone present. Her awakening is pure accident after being treated as an object of obsessive possession. She has no agency in her own rescue. She is acted upon by external forces, never an active participant in her salvation. When she opens her eyes and the prince immediately proposes marriage, she accepts, not because she's fallen in love, but because what choice does she have? She's been held captive by this man for an indeterminate period. She has no home to return to, her father presumably dead or disappeared, her stepmother still alive and dangerous. The prince represents the only path to safety available, even though that path is built on his obsession with owning her as a beautiful corpse. The psychology of the prince's obsession reveals disturbing truths about the objectification of women in patriarchal societies. He doesn't love Snow White as a person. He loves her as an aesthetic object, as something that pleases his eye, without making demands on his attention or requiring him to engage with her as a fully human subject. The glass coffin literalizes what many relationships with women involve. Metaphorically, the desire for beauty without autonomy, presence without voice, perfection without the messy reality of actual human relationship. Snow White in her coffin is the ultimate male fantasy made visible, eternally beautiful, eternally young, eternally silent, eternally available for visual consumption without risk of rejection or the need for actual emotional connection. The prince's love is masturbatory in nature, a projection of his desires onto an object that cannot refuse them. When Snow White awakens, does his love persist? The tale doesn't address this. It moves directly to marriage, as if survival requires Snow White to accept the role she's been assigned. Object of desire, possession of the powerful, grateful recipient of male attention regardless of how that attention was obtained or what it reveals about the man offering it. Two historical figures are frequently cited as inspirations for Snow White, both from regions where the Grimms collected tales. Margaretha von Waldeck was born in 1533, a German countess of exceptional beauty. Her mother died when she was 3, and her father remarried Katerina of Hatzfeld, who was reportedly strict and jealous of Margareta. At 16, Margareta was sent to Brussels, where she caught the eye of a Spanish prince, the future Philip II. This relationship was politically inconvenient. A German countess with a Spanish royal threatened existing alliances and succession plans. Margareta died at age 21, and historical rumors suggested arsenic poisoning. Evidence supports this. Her handwriting on her deathbed will show the tremulous, shaky quality characteristic of arsenic poisoning's effect on the nervous system. Her father owned copper mines that employed child laborers, providing the direct historical link to the poor dwarves of the tale. Maria Sophia von Erthal lived in Lohr am Main from 1725 to 1796. Her father, Prince Philipp Christoph von Erthal, gifted his second wife an elaborate mirror with a frame inscribed Amour propre, self-love. This mirror, produced by the local glass factory renowned throughout Europe, was famous for its extraordinary clarity. People said it always spoke the truth because its reflection was so perfect, so undistorted. To reach the mines from Maria Sophia's castle, travelers had to cross 7 hills, specifically the mountains of the Spessart forest. The abundance of deadly nightshade growing in those woods provides a plausible origin for the poisoned apple. Unlike Margareta, Maria Sophia survived into old age, but her stepmother's documented dislike of her and the existence of the talking mirror cemented her life as potential source material. What's significant about both women is that they lived in worlds where their beauty made them vulnerable. Margareta's beauty attracted a politically dangerous suitor, and she died conveniently before the marriage could proceed. Maria Sophia's beauty competed with her stepmother's need for validation and social standing. These weren't isolated cases. Court records from the period document patterns of mysterious illnesses befalling young noblewomen whose beauty or marriage prospects threatened existing power structures. Young girls who should have been cherished were instead viewed as threats or commodities. Their beauty determined their value in marriage negotiations, but also marked them for elimination if that beauty disrupted the wrong person's political position. The fairy tale encodes this reality, preserving testimony of actual crime in a narrative that could be safely transmitted across generations without explicitly accusing anyone of murder. The archival evidence surrounding these women reveals the mechanisms through which inconvenient daughters disappeared from historical record. Margareta's death was recorded simply as illness, with no investigation despite her youth and the political timing. Her father remarried within months, securing different alliances. The wealth she would have taken as dowry remained within his control. Similar patterns appear repeatedly in noble families of the period. Young women on the verge of advantageous marriages suddenly falling ill, their deaths benefiting mothers or fathers who then renegotiated better terms with different families. The physicians who attended these deaths rarely recorded suspicions. They couldn't. Accusing a noble family of poisoning their own daughter would end the physician's career or life. So the official records show only that young women died of fever, of fits, of mysterious wasting diseases. But the folk memory preserved what the official record could not. The understanding that mothers killed daughters when beauty threatened power, that families sacrificed their own children for political advantage, that no legal remedy existed for girls whose value as marriage pawns conflicted with their parents' strategic interests. The tale's conclusion features one of the most graphically violent punishments in all of fairy tale literature. At Snow White's wedding feast, the queen is recognized. She's forced to put on iron shoes that have been heated until they glow red, and then she must dance until she falls dead. Modern audiences often view this as unnecessarily cruel, as revenge that exceeds appropriate justice. But this punishment reflects specific legal frameworks of the Holy Roman Empire and early modern Germany. Under Germanic law, extreme violence against family members, parricide or infanticide, was met with public, spectacular executions intended to physically burn out the corruption of the offender's soul. The iron shoes were a real medieval execution method reserved specifically for familial crimes, particularly those involving mothers who killed or attempted to kill their children. The punishment serves multiple symbolic functions. First, it's retributive justice, punishment as a good in itself, meant to right the cosmic balance upset by the queen's crimes. The physical agony she experiences is proportional to the suffering she inflicted, not just on Snow White, but on the natural order itself. In medieval Christian cosmology, a mother killing her child violated the fundamental structure of creation. Such crimes required supernatural levels of retribution because they were offenses against God's design for human relationships. Second, the dance itself is significant. The queen spent her life concerned with appearance, with maintaining the youthful beauty that allowed her to hold power. Now she's forced to perform, to display herself publicly as her body destroys itself, her vanity literally consuming her from the feet up. Third, the public nature of the execution matters. This isn't a quiet death behind closed doors. The entire wedding court watches as the queen dances to her death. Her punishment becomes spectacle, a pedagogical tool meant to socialize observers by showing the consequences of transgressing social norms. The happiness of the ending is contingent on the gratifying awareness that the rival has been fantastically punished. This reflects Old Testament notions of recompense found throughout European folklore. The idea that evil must be visibly, physically destroyed for goodness to be fully restored. The queen's death cleanses the kingdom, allows Snow White's marriage to proceed, restores the social order that was disrupted when the mother turned against the daughter. But notice what the tale doesn't address. Snow White marries a man who fell in love with her corpse, who kept her in a glass coffin as a possession. Her father, if he's still alive, abandoned her to her mother's violence and never appears to rescue her. She spent months or years in servitude to exploited child laborers, cooking and cleaning to earn her survival. The happy ending is only happy if we ignore everything that came before, if we accept that marriage to a prince erases all trauma, if we believe that the queen's death somehow compensates for the systematic abuse and exploitation that characterized Snow White's entire young life. The tale ends with a wedding, but it's a wedding born of necrophilic obsession and survival calculation, not love. The restoration of order requires us to accept that a young girl's only path to safety is through marriage to a man whose attraction to her began when he thought she was dead. The execution method itself deserves closer examination. Red-hot iron shoes weren't simply about causing pain. They were about forcing the condemned to participate in their own destruction. The queen must dance, must keep moving, must actively contribute to the burning of her own flesh. She can't simply stand still and endure. The momentum of the dance, the movement required, ensures that every part of her feet makes contact with the searing metal. This active participation transforms the execution from something done to her into something she does to herself, a final humiliation that strips away any possibility of martyrdom or dignity in death. The method also ensures prolonged suffering. Death doesn't come quickly from burning feet. It comes from shock, from infection, from the systemic failure that follows severe burns. The queen dances until she can no longer dance, until her body simply gives out, and the court watches every moment. This is justice as entertainment, punishment as public performance, violence as pedagogy. The audience learns that crimes against the natural order will be met with unnatural suffering, that mothers who betray their children will be forced to destroy themselves, that vanity will literally consume those who worship it. The tale offers no mercy, no possibility of redemption, no chance for the queen to repent or reform. She is evil, and evil must be burned away, painfully and publicly, so that goodness can flourish in a kingdom cleansed by her agony. At its deepest level, Snow White explores what modern psychology calls malignant narcissism, the inability to tolerate being surpassed, even by one's own children. The queen's behavior follows patterns clinicians recognize today. She views her daughter not as a separate person with inherent worth, but as an extension of herself, a reflection that should confirm her superiority. When Snow White's beauty exceeds her own, the queen experiences what researchers call narcissistic injury, a psychological wound that feels like annihilation. Her sense of self is so fragile, so dependent on being the fairest, that any challenge to this position triggers a fight-or-flight response. Since she can't flee from her own obsolescence, she fights by attempting to destroy the evidence of her decline. This helps explain the specific nature of the queen's violence. She doesn't simply want Snow White dead. She wants to consume her, to incorporate her daughter's youth into her own body. This is psychological cannibalism made literal, the narcissistic parent who feeds on the child's vitality, who views the child's accomplishments or beauty as either confirmation of the parent's superiority or threat to it. The queen can't celebrate Snow White's beauty because she experiences it as theft, as if beauty is a finite resource, and the daughter's possession of it diminishes the mother's share. Modern clinical literature documents this pattern in narcissistic family systems. The parent who alternates between basking in the child's reflected glory and sabotaging the child when their independent success threatens the parent's self-image. The tale also encodes understanding of intergenerational trauma. The queen likely grew up in a world that taught her that her value was entirely contingent on her beauty, that taught her to view other women as competitors, that provided no model for female solidarity or support. She internalized these lessons so completely that when confronted with her daughter's superior beauty, she can't imagine any response except elimination. The tragedy is that both women are victims of the same system, but the mother has become its enforcer, perpetuating the cycle of violence against the next generation. Snow White will grow up having learned that beauty is dangerous, that maternal love is conditional and potentially lethal, that survival requires constant vigilance and strategic alliances with those who have power. The psychological dynamics at play reveal how patriarchal systems pit women against each other by making their worth dependent on a limited resource, male attention and validation. In a world where women derive power only through their attractiveness to men, where aging represents social death, mothers and daughters become natural enemies. The mother's declining beauty isn't just an aesthetic concern. It's an existential threat. Every compliment her daughter receives is proof that her own time is ending. Every young man who looks at the daughter instead of the mother is evidence that her power is transferring to the next generation. The system creates a zero-sum game where one woman's gain is another's loss, where solidarity between women becomes psychologically impossible because they're competing for survival in a social structure that discards women the moment they cease to be sexually desirable. What makes the queen's psychology so disturbing is that it's entirely logical within the constraints of her world. She's not insane or irrational. She's responding rationally to an insane system, one that taught her that her entire worth resides in her beauty, that her power derives solely from being the fairest, that aging is not a natural process, but a failure, a crime against her own value. When the mirror announces that she's no longer the fairest, it's announcing her death sentence within the social order she inhabits. Her attempts to kill Snow White are attempts to survive, to maintain her position, to refuse the role of discarded woman that her society has prepared for her. The horror isn't that she's a monster. It's that the system creates monsters, transforms mothers into murderers, makes violence seem like the only rational response to the inevitable passage of time. Snow White doesn't just preserve a cautionary tale about a wicked queen. It documents how patriarchal beauty standards create intergenerational violence, how systems that reduce women to their physical appearance make mothers and daughters into enemies, how the internalization of oppressive standards transforms victims into perpetrators. The transformation of this tale into children's entertainment represents one of the most successful acts of historical erasure ever accomplished. Each adaptation moved further from the source material's darkness. The 1937 Disney version eliminated every warning element the original contained. The mother became unambiguously a stepmother. The dwarfs became comic figures who sing and whistle while they work, with no hint of their origins as exploited child laborers. The prince's necrophilic obsession became true love's kiss. Snow White transformed from a 7-year-old abuse victim into a singing teenager whose main concerns are housework and romance. The queen's consumption of her daughter's organs vanished entirely, replaced with a vague sense that she's wicked without specific reference to what that wickedness entailed. The sanitization was so complete that modern audiences have no idea they're watching a story that originally documented systematic child abuse and attempted filicide. Yet the darkness persists even in sanitized versions. Children instinctively recognize something wrong with the tale. They ask why the mother wants Snow White dead if Snow White hasn't done anything wrong. They ask why she has to live with strangers instead of her father protecting her. They ask why the prince falls in love with someone he thinks is dead. These questions point to the cognitive dissonance created when a horror story is disguised as a fairy tale. The darkness bleeds through because it's structural to the narrative. You can't remove it without the story collapsing entirely. What was lost in sanitization is the tale's function as warning and preparation. The original story taught children that danger could come from those who should protect them, that beauty could be a death sentence, that survival might require leaving home and accepting exploitation as the lesser evil compared to staying. It taught young women to recognize narcissistic rage in their mothers, to understand that their emerging beauty might trigger violence, to know that the legal system wouldn't protect them and their only hope was finding extra-legal communities of fellow survivors. These lessons were encoded in symbol and metaphor, but they were legible to their original audiences in ways we've forgotten. By making the tale safe for children, we removed its utility as a survival manual. We transformed testimony into entertainment, stripped warning into wish fulfillment, replaced psychological truth with romantic fantasy. The process of sanitization reveals cultural anxieties about confronting uncomfortable truths. Each generation that retold Snow White removed elements that seemed too disturbing, too explicit, too challenging to contemporary values. But in doing so, they also removed the tale's power to prepare children for real dangers. The original version didn't pretend that families were always safe, that mothers always protected their children, that beauty was always celebrated rather than punished. It acknowledged the darkness within domestic spaces, the violence that could erupt from jealousy and fear, the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable. By sanitizing these elements, we created a false narrative of safety, one that left children unprepared for abuse when it occurred because they'd been taught that such things only happened in stories, and even then, only to characters who somehow deserved it, or who were saved by magical intervention. The Disney version, in particular, reveals the ideological work of mid-20th century American culture. Snow White becomes passive, her survival dependent entirely on male rescue. Her domestic labor is presented as natural female behavior rather than transactional survival strategy. The dwarves become lovable helpers rather than fellow victims of exploitation. The prince's kiss becomes romantic rather than disturbing. Every element that suggested systemic violence, that hinted at the reality of child abuse or maternal betrayal or necrophilic objectification, gets transformed into something palatable, something that reinforces rather than challenges existing power structures. The sanitized version teaches girls that their worth lies in beauty and domesticity, that men will rescue them if they're pretty and passive enough, that evil is always punished and goodness always rewarded. These lessons are comfortable but false, and they leave children vulnerable to the very real dangers that the original tale tried to warn against. We've traded preparation for comfort, awareness for reassurance. And in doing so, we've lost the tale's true value as a tool for survival in a world that remains dangerous for the young, the beautiful, and the vulnerable. The power of Snow White lies in its unflinching documentation of how beauty operates as both currency and death sentence in patriarchal systems. The tale shows us a world where women derive power only through their physical appearance, where aging is experienced as erasure, where daughters are threats to be eliminated or commodities to be traded. It shows us maternal love twisted into murderous envy, childhood as a state of constant vulnerability, and survival requiring exploitation of oneself and others. These dynamics didn't end with the medieval period. The Queen's desperate attempts to remain the fairest speak to contemporary anxieties about aging, about the way women are discarded when they no longer meet beauty standards, about the impossible standards that pit women against each other in competition for male validation. The glass coffin resonates because it represents the ongoing objectification of women, desired for passivity, for being beautiful while silent, for existing as decoration rather than agent. Snow White's lack of choice in her rescue and subsequent marriage reflects how women's lives are still shaped by forces beyond their control, how safety often requires accepting problematic relationships because the alternatives are worse. The tale's encoded warnings about mothers who view daughters as competition remain relevant in a culture where mothers are expected to maintain impossible standards of youthful appearance while raising daughters who will inevitably surpass them. The toxic dynamics the tale explores: narcissistic injury, intergenerational trauma, survival through servitude, persist in patterns of family violence and dysfunction that clinical psychology continues to document. The brothers Grimm, trained as legal scholars, knew the court records. They knew about the investigations that never went anywhere, the young girls who disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances, the mothers who inherited their daughters' dowries or marriage prospects. They wrapped that horrific reality in just enough fantasy to make it tellable, but left enough truth that anyone who knew where to look could see the warning underneath. In their marginalia, they wrote Mahnung und Warnung, reminder and warning. This wasn't meant to be entertainment, it was meant to be preparation. The tale teaches that the greatest threat to a child might come from within her own home, that beauty without protection is vulnerability, that survival requires recognizing danger in familiar faces and seeking safety wherever it can be found, even among those who are themselves exploited and damaged. Snow White isn't a bedtime story. It's a crime scene preserved in narrative form, evidence disguised as entertainment. The fairest of them all was never about beauty. It was about a child marked for death by possessing the very quality that should have been celebrated. A girl who survived not through purity or passivity, but through adaptation, through learning to trade labor for protection, through accepting problematic alliances because they offered paths to survival. Once you recognize what you're really reading, the illusion collapses. You see the encoded warnings about maternal narcissism and domestic violence, the documentation of child exploitation in mining communities, the critique of systems that reduce women's worth to their beauty and pit them against each other in lethal competition. You see testimony preserved across centuries, horror made transmissible through symbol, warning disguised as wish fulfillment. The contemporary relevance of Snow White becomes clear when we examine ongoing patterns of violence against women and children. Mothers still harm daughters whose beauty or success threatens the mother's self-image, though we now recognize this as psychological abuse rather than attempted murder. Women still compete for male attention in zero-sum games, still internalize beauty standards that make aging feel like death, still view other women as threats rather than allies. Children still face abuse within families, while systems that should protect them fail to intervene. Young people still flee homes only to find themselves in exploitative labor situations, trading one form of suffering for another. The prince who desires passive, silent beauty persists in men who prefer women who don't challenge them, who see relationships as possession rather than partnership. The glass coffin exists in every expectation that women should be beautiful objects rather than complex subjects, should be seen but not heard, should exist for male pleasure rather than their own autonomous purposes. What makes the tale's preservation so crucial is that it refuses to pretend these dynamics don't exist. It doesn't offer false comfort or easy solutions. It acknowledges that sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones who harm you, that beauty can be as much curse as blessing, that survival might require compromise and strategic alliance with imperfect partners. It recognizes that evil isn't always punished, that justice doesn't always arrive, that sometimes the best outcome is simply survival rather than triumph. By encoding these truths in symbolic form, the brothers Grimm created a survival manual disguised as entertainment, a way to transmit knowledge about predatory behavior, systematic exploitation, and psychological manipulation across generations without triggering the censorship that explicit discussion would provoke. The enduring power of Snow White lies in its refusal to lie about the world's darkness. It tells us that mothers can be monsters, that beauty is dangerous, that childhood innocence is no protection against violence, that the legal system fails the vulnerable, that survival requires adaptation to exploitation rather than escape from it. These are uncomfortable truths, but they're truths nonetheless. The sanitized versions that promise rescue by true love, that transform abuse into adventure, that present happy endings as inevitable rewards for goodness. These versions fail the very children they claim to entertain. They create false expectations that leave the young unprepared for the reality of abuse, exploitation, and systematic violence. The original tale, dark as it is, offers something more valuable than comfort. It offers preparation. It offers the understanding that the world contains real dangers, that those dangers often come from familiar sources, and that survival requires recognizing these threats and developing strategies to navigate them. In preserving this tale across centuries, in encoding warnings within what appears to be fantasy, the brothers Grimm left us something precious. The truth about power, violence, beauty, and survival. Disguised just enough to slip past the censors, but clear enough that those who need the warnings can find them. And the tale still speaks its terrible truth across the centuries, waiting for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear the testimony hidden in plain sight.